I spent 8 years building my luxury event design firm, Aura and Estate, from a cramped studio apartment filled with fabric samples into the premier design house for high society events. I know the exact weight of silk required to drape a grand ballroom so that it catches the light without sagging. I know how to source midnight blue hydrangeas from the only greenhouse in Europe that can grow them out of season. I built my empire on perfection, discretion, and an unshakable work ethic. In my world, I am the architect of illusions, turning millions of dollars into unforgettable nights for the city's elite. Yet to the family I was about to marry into, I was nothing more than a glorified low-class party planner who had clawed her way into rooms where she didn't belong. When I met Julian, I thought he was different. He was charming, soft-spoken, and possessed that quiet old-money confidence that I mistakenly equated with security. He belonged to the prestigious Vance family, a name that carried immense social weight, but, as I would later discover, was propped up by a rapidly crumbling financial foundation. His mother, Victoria Vance, was a woman carved from ice and entitlement. From the very first dinner at their drafty portrait-lined estate, she made her disdain clear. She looked at my tailored suit, smiled thinly, and remarked that it must be so fascinating to make a living out of making sure wealthy people had enough napkins. Julian sat beside me, offering a weak smile and squeezing my hand under the table, whispering later that his mother was just particular and from a different generation. I loved him, so I let the insult slide. I told myself that their approval didn't matter because my business was thriving and I was entirely self-sufficient. As our engagement progressed, Victoria's passive-aggressive barbs transformed into an active campaign of exclusion. Her absolute favorite person in the world was her eldest son, Christian, the undisputed golden child of the family. Christian had spent the last 5 years in a volatile, highly publicized relationship with Alyssa, the daughter of a prominent real estate mogul. Alyssa was cruel, arrogant, and treated me like hired help whenever our paths crossed at country club functions. Victoria openly worshipped Alyssa, frequently dropping hints about how a true woman of lineage elevated the Vance name. Even though Julian and I were the ones getting married, Victoria constantly shifted the spotlight to Christian and Alyssa, treating our upcoming nuptials as a secondary, minor inconvenience on the social calendar. Desperate to show Julian that I supported him, and eager to prove my worth to his family once and for all, I made a decision that I would soon deeply regret. I decided to completely gift them our wedding. I took over the entire production, designing a masterclass in luxury that would normally cost a client upwards of $120,000. Because of my premier industry connections, I was able to secure the most exclusive historic estate venue in the state, a place with a 2-year waiting list. I signed every contract under my corporate tax ID and financed the entire operation through my business accounts. I kept the financial details quiet, letting Julian believe that my success was taking care of us. Victoria, however, naturally assumed that the Vance family name was the only reason the venue had agreed to host us. She began bragging to her high society friends about the magnificent gala she was orchestrating, completely erasing my name, my effort, and my money from the narrative. The lead up to the wedding week was when the atmosphere turned completely suffocating. I began to notice a chilling shift in Julian's behavior. The supportive man I fell in love with was slowly being replaced by a defensive, distant stranger. He stopped looking me in the eye when his mother spoke down to me during planning meetings. When Victoria demanded that we upgrade the floral arrangements to imported orchids and add a top-shelf open bar that would add an extra $15,000 to the tab, I looked to Julian for backup. Instead of standing with me, he sighed, adjusted his collar, and muttered that we should just do what his mother wanted to keep the peace. "It's just money, Maya," he told me one night, his voice laced with an irritation I had never heard before. "My family has a reputation to uphold. We can't look cheap in front of the board of directors." I stared at him, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. "It's just money." He said it so carelessly, entirely unaware that the money he was volunteering belonged to the woman he was supposed to protect, not his mother's non-existent trust funds. I realized then that Victoria had been whispering in his ear, convincing him that my wealth was something the family was entitled to use to restore their fading glory. I kept my mouth shut, but that night I opened my laptop and reviewed my hidden business ledger. Every vendor contract, every security deposit, every single piece of crystal and linen booked for that weekend was tied directly to my personal signature and my corporate accounts. They were living in a fantasy world built entirely on my dime, and they didn't even have the decency to treat the builder with respect. The red flags reached a boiling point 48 hours before the wedding. I caught Julian in the hallway of his mother's house, huddled over his phone, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. When he saw me, he flinched and immediately locked the screen. When I asked him who he was talking to, he snapped, telling me I was being paranoid and stressed from wedding planning. Later that evening, I saw a notification pop up on his tablet, which was synced to his messages. It was a text from his brother Christian, reading, "Mom got it all sorted out for the rehearsal dinner. Alyssa is on board. Just make sure Maya doesn't make a scene." I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know what they were planning, but a sickening intuition told me that the trap had already been set. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived, and the venue was nothing short of a masterpiece. I had transformed the historic estate's sunroom into an ethereal wonderland. Amber candlelight danced across tables draped in custom silk, and the scent of white roses filled the air. Over 100 of the city's most influential figures, judges, CEOs, and old money matriarchs, filled the room, laughing and sipping champagne. I wore a stunning, understated ivory designer dress, feeling, for the briefest moment, like a true bride. I had poured my heart into this space. It was the perfect reflection of my talent. Then the heavy double doors of the sunroom swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop to sub-zero. Victoria entered, draped in diamonds, flanked by Christian. But walking arm in arm with them wasn't just family, it was Alyssa. She was wearing a flamboyant, mere-white gown that looked egregiously like a wedding dress. The room fell into a stunned murmur as Victoria began parading Alyssa around the room, loudly introducing her to prominent guests as the true jewel of the family, and openly lamenting how she wished certain people had the grace and lineage that Alyssa possessed. I stood frozen, watching the woman who had tormented me for years smile triumphantly at me from across the room. The ultimate execution of their cruelty was saved for the seating arrangements. As the guests began to take their places for the formal dinner, I walked toward the head table, where Julian was already seated. I looked down at the seat directly to his right, the seat reserved for the bride. My custom calligraphy name card was gone. In its place was a card that read, "Alyssa." Before I could even process what I was looking at, Victoria stepped up behind me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her voice was intentionally loud, carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Oh, Maya dear, don't look so confused," Victoria sneered, a smug, venomous grin playing on her lips. "We had to make some executive adjustments. Alyssa belongs at the head table with the family. Someone of your background is much more suited for the service tables by the kitchen. After all, you're used to being on your feet working events, aren't you?" A collective gasp echoed through the room. I felt every eye pierce into me. Humiliation, hot and sharp, flushed through my veins. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to flip the table, to grab my hand, to defend the woman he was marrying in 48 hours. But Julian wouldn't even look at me. He stared intently at his plate, adjusting his silver cuffs, and muttered under his breath so only I could hear, "Just go sit at the back table, Maya." Don't make a scene in front of my mother's friends. It's just a seat. We can talk about it later." In that exact moment of devastating silence, something inside me snapped. The blinding pain of heartbreak instantly hardened into something entirely different. Absolute, icy clarity. I looked at the man I had loved, looked at his monstrous mother, and realized they didn't see a partner. They saw a doormat with a large bank account. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply took a deep breath, looked Victoria dead in the eye, and smiled. I turned on my heel and walked out of the ballroom, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind me. The moment I stepped out into the cool night air, the tears stopped before they could even fall. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and pulled out my laptop. The dashboard clock read 9:30 p.m. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday at 4 p.m. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was hiding in a bathroom stall weeping, preparing to accept whatever scraps of dignity they threw at me the next day. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I logged into my corporate management portal. With a few swift keystrokes, I pulled up the primary financial ledger for the Vance-designated wedding event. My fingers hovered over the master control button. "You want a service worker, Victoria?" I whispered to the empty car. "Let me show you what happens when the staff walks out." At exactly 10 p.m., I executed a complete corporate freeze on the event budget. I systematically went down my contact list, making phone calls and sending high-priority, binding emails to every single vendor I had hired. I called the caterer, a high-end Michelin-starred chef who owed his biggest quarterly contracts to my firm. I told him the event was breached, the contract was nullified, and his staff was to stand down immediately. I emailed the floral distributors, the technical lighting crew, and the live 20-piece orchestra. Because these vendors valued their multi-year relationships with Aura and Estate, far more than a single night with a bankrupt old money family, every single one of them complied without hesitation. By midnight, the entire $120,000 infrastructure of the wedding had been systematically dismantled. But I wasn't done. The historic estate venue itself was the crown jewel of the weekend. The Vances believed their name had secured it. But the venue owner was actually my private business partner. The lease for the entire property for the weekend was signed under my personal name and paid for by my corporate account. I called the estate manager and informed him that the wedding was officially canceled due to a breach of contract by the groom's party. However, I explicitly stated that I was not relinquishing my lease on the property. I instructed him to double the private security detail at the front gates for the next day. And I gave him a very specific blacklist of names who were to be barred from entering under any circumstances. I sent out an urgent, exclusive digital invitation to my entire staff, my loyal vendors, and my true personal friends, inviting them to an all-expenses-paid, ultra-luxury customer and staff appreciation gala, to be held at the estate the following afternoon. Saturday morning broke with brilliant, blinding sunshine. I spent my morning at a luxury spa, sipping a mimosa, while my phone blew up on the vanity beside me. At 11 o'clock a.m., the frantic texts from Julian began. "Maya, where are you? The hair and makeup team isn't at the hotel. Maya, answer your phone. The transport shuttles haven't arrived for the guests." By 1 o'clock p.m., the texts turned into frantic, unhinged voicemails from Victoria, her Ice Queen facade completely shattering into high-pitched screeches. They had arrived at the hotel ballroom, expecting their lavish pre-wedding luncheon, only to find the room dark and completely empty. At 3:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled ceremony, I arrived at the historic estate venue. I was dressed in a spectacular emerald green silk gown, looking every bit the CEO I was. I walked up to the grand balcony, overlooking the long, winding driveway and the massive iron security gates of the property. Right on cue, a fleet of luxury cars and limousines pulled up to the gates. I watched from above, as Victoria, Julian, Christian, and Alyssa stepped out of their vehicles, fully dressed in their formal wedding attire. Julian in his tuxedo, Victoria in her mother-of-the-groom gown, and Alyssa looking ridiculous in her near-white dress. They expected the gates to swing open. Instead, they were met by 4 burly, stone-faced private security guards holding clipboards. I watched Victoria wave her hands wildly, pointing at the estate, undoubtedly screaming about who she was. The head security guard calmly stepped forward, shook his head, and handed her a laminated, legally binding trespass notice. Julian's face drained of all color as he looked up at the balcony and finally spotted me standing there, looking down at them like an empress, reviewing her subjects. My phone rang. It was Julian. This time I answered it, putting it on speakerphone as I leaned against the stone balustrade. "Maya, what is the meaning of this?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of panic and rage. "There are 200 guests arriving in 15 minutes. There is no food, no flowers, no music. The guards are saying we aren't on the list. Have you lost your mind?" I let the silence hang over the line for a long, agonizing moment before I spoke, my voice calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I haven't lost my mind, Julian. I just took your advice. I decided to stop making a scene, and I went to sit at the back table. In fact, I left the building entirely." In the background, I could hear Victoria grab the phone from his hand, her voice distorted with absolute fury. "You ungrateful, low-class little brat. Do you have any idea what you are doing to our family's reputation? Our board of directors is in those cars behind us. Fix this right now, or I will ruin you." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that cut through her screaming like a knife. "You can't ruin me, Victoria, because you don't own me, and you certainly don't own my money. You wanted a traditional wedding based on lineage and status, and you wanted to treat me like the help. So I decided to let you have exactly what you paid for, which, based on your family's actual bank statements, is absolutely nothing. Have a wonderful evening, marrying the heir." I hung up the phone and blocked their numbers permanently. Down at the gate, absolute chaos erupted. The Vance family's high society guests began arriving in their limousines, only to find the groom and his mother screaming at security guards in the driveway, completely locked out of a non-existent wedding. The news of the canceled $120,000 wedding and the revelation that the wealthy Vance family had tried to leech off a self-made woman, only to be locked out on the pavement, spread through the city's elite grapevine like wildfire. By Sunday morning, Victoria's social standing was completely incinerated, and Julian's family name became a laughingstock in the business community. I turned away from the balcony and walked back into the grand ballroom. The jazz band I hired for my staff gala began to play a sultry, beautiful melody. The tables were filled with my friends, my tireless coordinators, and the vendors who actually respected my craft. I raised a crystal glass of expensive champagne, looking out over the beautiful room I had designed, and toasted to the most flawless execution of my career. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding were when the air in the Vance estate grew heavy, thick with an unspoken arrogance that I was expected to swallow daily. It was during this time that the cracks in my fairy tale began to widen, shifting from hairline fractures into deep, echoing chasms. I was spending 14 hours a day managing my firm's high-profile corporate clients, only to spend my evenings sitting in Victoria's suffocating, velvet-draped parlor, subjected to what she called refining the itinerary. It was during these agonizingly long meetings that I noticed the first real shift in Julian. The man who used to make me coffee at midnight when I was buried under blueprint designs was gone. In his place stood someone who seemed to be reverting to the old money baseline of his upbringing. When we sat on Victoria's antique settee, Julian's posture changed. He sat taller, stiffer, and his eyes rarely met mine when his mother spoke. Whenever Victoria delivered a particularly sharp, passive-aggressive insult about my choices, I would instinctively look to Julian, waiting for the defensive partner I thought I knew. But he would just stare at his hands or seamlessly change the subject. It was as if my presence was a minor embarrassment he was trying to manage in front of his mother. The financial demands began as a trickle and quickly turned into a mudslide. Victoria called an emergency meeting at the estate under the guise of preserving the family's dignity. She sat behind her mahogany desk, a stack of heavily annotated design mock-ups resting beneath her manicured fingers. She didn't look at me as I entered. She simply slid a piece of heavy cream cardstock across the wood toward me. It was a list of mandatory revisions. She wanted to scrap the local white roses I had meticulously secured and replace them with rare imported white orchids from Holland. She demanded a premium champagne tower upon guest arrival, an additional 12-course late-night tasting menu, and an extra 50 invitations sent out to her personal country club registry. People I had never met in my life. When I calculated the numbers in my head, these minor adjustments added an immediate $45,000 to the already inflated budget. I looked up, keeping my voice carefully modulated to the professional tone I used with difficult corporate clients, and explained that changing the floral imports this late would break our timeline and significantly alter the financial allocation. Victoria didn't flinch. She merely took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes glinting with a cold, patronizing amusement. She looked at me and said, "Maya dear, you must understand that a Vance wedding is not a common street festival. We have a standard to maintain. I'm sure whatever little allowance Julian has provided you from his inheritance accounts can cover the difference. We wouldn't want our guests thinking we've fallen on hard times because we chose a budget coordinator." The sheer audacity of her words left a metallic taste in my mouth. She truly believed that Julian was the one funding this entire production. She had constructed a narrative in her mind where her son was graciously allowing his working-class fiancé to play dress-up with his family's wealth. I opened my mouth to correct her, to tell her that Julian hadn't contributed a single cent to his inheritance fund in 3 years, and that every dime of the $120,000 came directly from the sweat and profit margins of my company. But before the words could leave my lips, Julian reached over and tightly gripped my wrist under the table. His grip wasn't comforting. It was a warning. He looked at his mother, smiled his charming, compliant smile, and said, "Of course, Mother, we'll take care of the invoices. Maya will update the vendors tonight, anything to make sure the family looks flawless." When we got into the car that night, the silence between us was deafening. I slammed my laptop onto the dashboard, turning to him with a fury I could no longer contain. I asked him how he could volunteer my company's capital so carelessly, and how he could let his mother sit there and insult my profession while I was single-handedly building the stage for his family's social survival. Julian didn't apologize. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his jaw tightly clenched. He snapped at me, his voice sharp and dismissive, telling me that I didn't understand the pressures of his world. He said it was just money, and that since my business was doing so well, I shouldn't be so provincial about the costs. He told me that once we were married, his family's social network would elevate my business to a completely new tier, so I should view this as an investment into my future social standing. That comment was the first time I felt a cold, calculating detachment take root inside my chest. He didn't see my wealth as a testament to my hard work. He saw it as a resource that belonged to his family by right of their surname. He was gaslighting me into believing that my labor was a down payment for entry into his hollow social club. I didn't argue further. I simply leaned back against the leather seat, staring out at the passing streetlights, letting him believe he had won the argument. When we arrived home, I waited for Julian to fall asleep. Once the house was completely silent, I sat at my desk in the dark, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. I opened the master ledger for Aura and Estate. With methodical precision, I reviewed every contract I had finalized over the past 6 months. The floral design, the premium catering group, the lighting designers, the valet services, and the exclusive rental agreement for the historic estate itself. Every single document was stamped with my corporate tax identification number. Every security deposit had been paid via my firm's wire routing code. Legally, the Vances didn't exist on these documents. They were ghosts in a machine that I completely owned. I realized then that I held a financial kill switch to the entire event, while they were walking around the city, acting as if they were the directors of the play. I quietly closed the ledger, a cold comfort settling over me. The illusion was theirs, but the reality was mine. The final red flag dropped like a guillotine 48 hours before the rehearsal dinner. I had come to the Vance estate unannounced to drop off the finalized seating charts for the main reception. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward Julian's old study, I heard the muffled sound of voices through the heavy mahogany door. It was Julian and his older brother, Christian. I paused, my hand hovering over the brass doorknob. Christian's voice was loud, carrying easily through the wood. He was laughing, that arrogant, booming laugh that always made my skin crawl. He told Julian that Mom was thrilled with how everything was turning out, and that it was about time Julian brought some real asset value into the family dynamic. Then came Julian's voice, lower, but laced with a casual, dismissive tone that broke something fundamental inside me. He chuckled and said, "Yeah, well, she's a perfectionist. Let her handle the heavy lifting and the bills for now. Once the ring is on her finger, we'll restructure the business accounts anyway. She'll fall in line once she realizes how much she needs the Vance name to stay in those rooms." My breath hitched in my throat. My blood turned to absolute ice. They weren't just exploiting my generosity for a wedding. They were actively planning to cannibalize my life's work the moment the legal documents were signed. They viewed me as a profitable acquisition, a naive girl so desperate for their old money validation that she would hand over the keys to her kingdom just to carry their name. I stepped back from the door, my heels making no sound on the thick Persian rug. I walked out of the house, leaving the seating charts on the console table in the foyer. I sat in my car, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, not from sadness, but from a profound, burning rage. The trap had been set for me, built on a foundation of systemic disrespect, financial entitlement, and absolute deceit. They thought they were the predators, and they thought I was the prey. No idea that I was the one who had built the cage they were currently standing in, and the week was far from over. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived, and the historic estate's sunroom was nothing short of an ethereal wonderland. I had spent months designing this specific space, poured my heart into every micro detail, treating it as the grand opening of the rest of my life. Amber candlelight danced across tables draped in custom, heavy silk, cascading down to the marble floor. The scent of thousands of white roses filled the air, thick and sweet. Over 100 of the city's most influential figures, Supreme Court judges, tech CEOs, and old money matriarchs filled the room, their laughter mingling with the soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I wore a stunning, understated ivory designer dress, my hair swept up elegantly. For the first hour, as guests complimented the breathtaking design of the room, I allowed myself to forget the chilling conversation I had overheard 48 hours prior. I allowed myself to feel like a true bride. Then the heavy oak double doors of the sunroom swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly to sub-zero. Victoria entered, draped in a cascading diamond necklace, her posture radiating absolute dominance. Beside her was the golden child, Christian, but walking arm in arm with them wasn't just family, it was Alyssa. My breath caught in my throat. Alyssa was Christian's toxic, wealthy ex-girlfriend, a woman whose family owned half the real estate in the commercial district. She was wearing a flamboyant, heavily embellished gown that was so close to white, it was an explicit, unmitigated insult to any bride. The room fell into a stunned, hushed murmur as Victoria began parading Alyssa around the floor, loudly introducing her to prominent board members as the true jewel of high society, openly lamenting to anyone who would listen how much she missed having a woman of impeccable lineage by her side. Alyssa didn't even look at Christian. Her eyes were locked entirely on me, a triumphant, razor-sharp smirk plastered across her face. I looked around the room for Julian, finding him already seated at the grand head table, staring intensely at his cocktail. He had arrived early, ostensibly to check the seating arrangements, a task he had never once cared about before. As the chimes rang out signaling the formal dinner, the guests began to take their places. I walked calmly toward the head table, ready to take my rightful place at the center, directly to the right of my fiancé. I approached the beautifully styled head table and looked down at the seat next to Julian. My custom calligraphy name card, which I had personally verified the day before, was gone. In its place rested a heavy, gold-embossed card that read, Alyssa. Before my brain could fully process the sight, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Victoria's heels sounded behind me. I turned to find her standing less than a foot away, her fingers wrapped tightly around a glass of champagne. She didn't lower her voice. In fact, she projected it, ensuring her words cut through the ambient chatter of the entire ballroom. "Oh, Maya, dear, don't look so utterly bewildered," Victoria sneered, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, cold pleasure. "We had to make some necessary executive adjustments before dinner. Alyssa is family, and she belongs at the head table with people of her own circle. Someone of your practical background is much more suited for the service tables back by the kitchen doors. After all, you're used to being on your feet working events, aren't you? It only makes sense for you to be near the staff." A collective suffocating gasp echoed through the immediate tables. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The silence that followed was heavy, violent, and absolute. I felt over 100 pairs of eyes pierce straight into my back. Humiliation, hot and blinding, flushed through my veins, making my ears ring. I didn't look at Victoria. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me shrink. Instead, I slowly turned my head to look down at Julian. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. I waited for the man who had promised to love and protect me to push his chair back, tear Alyssa's card from the table, and demand his mother apologize to his future wife. I was silently begging him with my eyes to show a single shred of the spine he claimed to have. But Julian wouldn't even meet my gaze. He stared fixedly at his silver fork, his face flushed a deep, cowardly red. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat, and leaned slightly toward me, muttering in a hushed, irritated whisper that felt like a physical blow to my chest. "Just go sit at the back table, Maya, please. Don't make a scene in front of my mother's friends and the investors. It's just a chair. We can talk about this at the hotel later tonight. Just do this for me." In that exact agonizing second of silence, the last remaining fracture of my heart didn't just break, it vaporized. And in its place, a profound, terrifyingly calm clarity took over. I looked at the pathetic man sitting in front of me, looked at his monstrous mother, and realized the absolute truth. They didn't see a partner, a bride, or a human being. They saw an asset to be used, a bank account to be drained, and a woman they could publicly degrade to assert their fragile, fading dominance. They thought my love made me weak. They thought my silence meant I was desperate for their acceptance. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy coldness settle into my bones. The humiliation vanished, replaced by an unshakable, dark amusement. I looked directly at Victoria, holding her gaze until her smug smile slightly faltered under the sheer weight of my stare. Then I looked down at Julian one last time. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly steady, carrying cleanly through the silent sunroom. "It is just a chair." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply turned on my heel, my ivory dress catching the candlelight as I walked with effortless grace down the center aisle of the sunroom. I walked past the stunned faces of the city's elite, through the grand arched exit, and let the heavy mahogany doors slam shut behind me, leaving them all in the beautiful room I had built, completely unaware that the foundation beneath their feet had just been set on fire. The moment the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, the muffled laughter and clinking crystal of the sunroom faded into a distant, hollow hum. I walked through the vaulted stone corridors of the estate, my heels clicking with a slow, deliberate rhythm on the marble floors. I didn't run. I didn't hide my face. When the valet handed me the keys to my car, he offered a polite smile, entirely unaware that the woman in the ivory designer dress walking out into the crisp night air had just witnessed the death of her own engagement. I got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and let the absolute silence of the cabin wash over me. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My makeup was pristine, my eyes were completely dry. The hot, suffocating humiliation that had threatened to consume me at the head table had vanished, replaced by a cold, glittering stillness. I took off my diamond engagement ring, the ring Julian had assured me was a priceless family heirloom, but which my own jeweler had quietly informed me was a heavily included, lower-grade stone Victoria had passed down to save face, and dropped it carelessly into the cup holder. It made a cheap, metallic plink. I pulled my laptop from my leather work bag and set it across my lap. The dashboard clock glowed a cool neon blue, 9:45 p.m. The formal wedding ceremony was scheduled for exactly 42 hours from now. Julian, Victoria, and Alyssa were undoubtedly still sitting at the head table, sipping the champagne I bought, laughing about how successfully they had put the common party planner in her place. They genuinely believed that my love for Julian made me weak, that my desire for a family would make me endure whatever psychological crumbs they decided to throw at me. They thought I would spend the night crying into a pillow at my hotel, preparing to walk down the aisle on Saturday just to keep the peace. They had entirely forgotten who I was when I wasn't trying to be Julian's perfect fiancé. They forgot that I was the woman who had built Aura and Estate from nothing. They forgot that in the business world, I was known for being a ruthless negotiator and a master of logistical execution. I logged into my corporate banking portal and pulled up the master financial ledger for the Vance wedding production. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every single vendor contract, every security deposit, every piece of custom-built staging, and every single flight arrangement for the weekend was tied directly to my corporate tax identification number and backed by my company's line of credit. Legally, the Vance family did not exist on these documents. They were merely listed as the honorary design concepts on a project folder that I owned entirely. At exactly 10 p.m., I began the systematic deconstruction of their social fantasy. My first phone call was to Marcus, the owner of the elite Michelin-starred catering group I had hired for the reception. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice tinged with surprise, given the hour. I didn't offer a dramatic explanation. I spoke to him in the precise, ice-cold tone I reserved for severe corporate contract breaches. Marcus, it's Maya. I am officially invoking the emergency cancellation clause on Project Vance, effective immediately. Freeze all food preparation, stand down your culinary team, and do not load the refrigeration trucks tomorrow morning. Your full deposit is retained as a cancellation fee, and I am transferring the remaining balance to a new corporate event file under my firm's name. I need your absolute discretion on this. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew exactly how much business my firm brought his company every year. We represented nearly 40% of his annual revenue. He didn't ask questions. He didn't defend the Vances. He simply replied, "Understood, Maya. The kitchen is standing down. Consider it done." Next, I drafted a high-priority, encrypted email memo to the elite network of subcontractors I had assembled. The artisan cake designers, the premium floral wholesalers, the custom lighting engineers, the valet services, and the 20-piece live orchestra traveling from out of state. In my industry, your word and your financial reliability are everything. These vendors didn't care about the fading social cachet of the Vance surname. They cared about the multi-million-dollar corporate contracts Aura and Estate controlled. I informed them that due to a material breach of contract by the groom's party, the wedding was terminated. I guaranteed their baseline fees out of my corporate accounts, ensuring they suffered zero financial loss, but attached a mandatory non-disclosure and non-cooperation clause. If any vendor attempted to work with Victoria or Julian independently this weekend, they would be permanently blacklisted from every luxury event my firm designed in the tri-state area. By 11:30 p.m., the responses poured in. One by one, the pillars of the $120,000 wedding vanished into thin air. Then came the final, most devastating counterstroke: the venue itself. The historic estate was a sweeping multi-million-dollar property with a notorious 2-year waiting list for weddings. Victoria had been telling everyone at her country club that the estate owner had granted the booking as a personal favor to her late husband's legacy. The truth was far more transactional. The owner of the estate was a principal investor in my design firm, and the exclusive rental agreement for the entire weekend was signed under my personal name and fully paid for through my corporate account. I called the estate's general manager, Arthur, who was a close professional ally. I told him that the wedding was canceled, but that I was not relinquishing my exclusive lease on the property for Saturday. Arthur listened intently as I laid out the parameters of the new guest list. I gave him a very specific, ironclad blacklist of names who were to be barred from entering the property under any circumstances: Victoria Vance, Julian Vance, Christian Vance, and Alyssa Sterling. If any of these individuals attempt to breach the perimeter, I instructed calmly, they are to be served with a formal pre-drafted trespass notice immediately. If they refuse to leave the driveway, your security team is authorized to contact local law enforcement to have them removed for disturbing a private corporate function. It will be handled with absolute precision, Miss Lara, Arthur replied, his voice professional and unyielding. The gate manifests are being updated right now. Security will have explicit instructions. By 2 a.m., the digital invitations to my revised guest list had been deployed. I invited my entire administrative staff, my lead designers, my production crew, my most loyal local vendors, and my true personal friends who had watched me sacrifice my sanity for a man who didn't deserve it. I offered them an open invitation to experience a night of unparalleled luxury, a $120,000 production transformed into a celebration of our own success. I closed my laptop and set it back in my bag. I looked down at the cup holder, where Julian's ring sat reflecting the distant yellow glow of the estate's exterior lights. They had spent months trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that I was a secondary character in their grand old money narrative. They believed that because I worked in service of their illusions, I was beneath them. They were about to learn a brutal, unforgettable lesson in modern economics. Victoria and Julian had the name, the titles, and the empty social arrogance, but I was the one who held the capital, the contracts, and the absolute power to turn their most important social night into a public execution. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine purring to life, and drove away into the midnight dark, completely at peace with the wreckage I was about to leave in my wake. Saturday morning broke with brilliant, blinding sunshine, the kind of aggressively beautiful weather you pray for on your wedding day. I didn't wake up in the cramped, overly air-conditioned bridal suite of the hotel I had booked for the bridal party. Instead, I woke up in a private cabana at an ultra-exclusive wellness spa on the other side of the city. I spent my morning draped in a plush Egyptian cotton robe, sipping a freshly pressed mimosa, while a massage therapist worked the lingering tension of the past 2 years out of my shoulders. I had left my phone sitting on the marble vanity, face up, on silent. Around 10:30 a.m., the screen lit up with the first text message. It was from Julian. "Maya, where are you? The hair and makeup team you booked isn't answering the concierge. Mom is starting to panic." I took a slow sip of my mimosa and didn't touch the phone. 20 minutes later, the screen lit up again. "Maya, answer your phone right now. The florist hasn't dropped off the boutonnieres, and the transportation shuttles for the groomsmen haven't arrived. Where the hell are you?" By noon, the texts had devolved into a frantic, unhinged stream of consciousness, punctuated by back-to-back incoming calls from both Julian and Victoria. I let every single one roll to voicemail. While I was indulging in a sea salt scrub, I listened to Victoria's voice messages through my AirPods. The transformation of her tone was a masterclass in psychological collapse. The first voicemail was her usual icy, condescending self, demanding that I stop playing games and fix the logistical errors immediately. By the fourth voicemail, her facade had completely shattered into a high-pitched, hyperventilating screech. They had arrived at the hotel's lower banquet hall, expecting their lavish, pre-wedding catered luncheon, only to find the room dark, the tables bare, and the hotel manager politely explaining that the vendor had completely withdrawn their services the night before. At 2:30 p.m., I finally left the spa and made my way to the historic estate. I didn't wear ivory, I didn't wear a veil. I was dressed in a spectacular, custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that clung to my frame perfectly, paired with a sharp structural blazer draped over my shoulders. I looked every bit the CEO I was. When I arrived, the estate manager, Arthur, met me at the front portico with a wide smile and a glass of vintage champagne. The venue looked breathtaking. My staff had worked through the morning to modify the floral arrangements and lighting, transforming the space from a traditional wedding aesthetic into a sleek, ultra-luxury corporate gala. I walked up the sweeping mahogany staircase to the grand stone balcony that overlooked the long, winding cobblestone driveway and the massive iron security gates of the property. I leaned against the balustrade, the afternoon sun warming my face, and waited. Right on schedule, at 3:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, a haphazard fleet of rented town cars and black SUVs pulled up to the closed wrought iron gates. They had clearly been forced to scramble for last-minute transportation. I watched from above as Victoria, Julian, Christian, and Alyssa stepped out onto the pavement, fully dressed in their formal wedding attire. Julian was suffocating in his heavy tuxedo. Victoria was draped in her overly extravagant mother-of-the-groom gown, and Alyssa, hilariously, was still wearing the near-white dress she had weaponized the night before. They marched toward the gates, expecting them to magically swing open at the mere presence of the Vance family. Instead, they were immediately intercepted by 4 burly stone-faced private security guards holding clipboards. Even from the balcony, I could hear the shrill, indignant pitch of Victoria's voice echoing up the driveway. She was waving her hands wildly, pointing at the massive estate behind the gates, undoubtedly screaming about who she was, demanding they open the doors for the owners of the event. The head security guard didn't even flinch. He calmly stepped forward, shook his head, and handed Victoria a laminated, legally binding trespass notice. I watched as Victoria ripped it from his hands, read the first line, and physically stumbled backward, as if she had been struck. Julian snatched the paper from her, his eyes scanning the text. His face, visible even from a distance, drained of all color. He looked up, his panicked gaze desperately scanning the facade of the estate, until his eyes finally locked onto mine. He saw me standing on the balcony, looking down at them like an empress reviewing a line of mutinous subjects. My phone began to vibrate violently in my clutch. It was Julian. This time I answered it, tapping the speakerphone button as I rested my elbows casually on the stone railing. "Maya, what the hell is the meaning of this?" Julian screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of absolute panic and blind rage. There are 200 guests arriving in 15 minutes. The board of directors is going to be here any second. There is no food, no flowers, no music. The guards are saying we aren't on the list and that we're trespassing. Have you lost your damn mind? I let the silence hang over the line for a long, agonizing moment. I listened to his heavy, ragged breathing. When I spoke, my voice was perfectly calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of the affection I had once held for him. I haven't lost my mind, Julian, I replied evenly. I just took your advice. You told me not to make a scene. You told me to go sit at the back table. So I took it a step further. I left the building entirely, and I took my money with me. I could hear the frantic shuffling on the other end, before Victoria violently grabbed the phone from his hand. Her voice was distorted with absolute fury. "You ungrateful, low-class little brat," Victoria shrieked, all of her old money refinement evaporating into pure, unfiltered desperation. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to our family's reputation? Our entire social circle is in those cars behind us. You let us in. Or I swear to God, I will ruin your pathetic little party planning business." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that cut through her screaming like a diamond blade through glass. "You can't ruin me, Victoria," I said, my tone dropping to an icy whisper, "because you don't own me, and you certainly don't own my bank accounts. You wanted a traditional wedding based on lineage and status, and you wanted to treat me like the help while I paid for the privilege. So I decided to let you have exactly what you yourself paid for." I paused, letting the reality of their bankruptcy set in, which, based on your family's actual financial statements, is absolutely nothing. Have a wonderful evening, marrying the heir. "Maya, please, you can't," Julian pleaded, his voice suddenly breaking into a desperate sob in the background. I ended the call, opened my settings, and permanently blocked all of their phone numbers. Down at the gate, absolute unmitigated chaos erupted. The first wave of the Vance family's high society guests began arriving in their luxury vehicles, rolling down their tinted windows only to find the groom, his mother, and the golden child screaming at security guards on the public pavement, completely locked out of a non-existent wedding. They had no cover story. They had no way to hide the humiliation. The security guards handed the arriving guests polite cards explaining that the Vance wedding had been canceled due to a failure of financial securement by the groom's party, and instructed them to clear the driveway for private corporate guests. The social execution was swift and absolute. The news of the canceled $120,000 wedding spread through the city's elite grapevine before the sun even set. The revelation that the arrogant, wealthy Vance family had spent months trying to leech off a self-made woman, only to be locked out on the street holding a legally binding trespass notice, incinerated Victoria's social standing instantly. By Monday morning, Julian's family name wasn't just a joke, it was a radioactive hazard in the business community. Board members distanced themselves, country club invitations ceased, and the grand illusion they had spent decades cultivating was reduced to ash. I turned my back to the balcony and walked through the French doors into the grand ballroom. The atmosphere inside was electric. The 20-piece jazz band I had hired was playing a sultry, triumphant melody. The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of real crystal, and the warmth of genuine celebration. My administrative staff, my tireless event coordinators, and the vendors who actually respected my craft were all there, dining on a Michelin-starred menu that I had paid for. Arthur approached me with a silver tray, offering me a fresh glass of vintage champagne. I took it, smiling as my lead floral designer ran up to hug me, complimenting the breathtaking emerald gown. I looked out over the beautiful room I had designed, surrounded by people who valued my mind, my talent, and my friendship. I raised my glass to the room, taking a long, satisfying sip. It was the most flawless execution of my career. I hadn't just designed an unforgettable gala. I had designed my own freedom.